Hey there guys, welcome to my reaction video to the Resident Evil 4 Remake gameplay that was shown by Game Informer about a week ago. I know I'm getting into this very late, but not only was I dealing with a couple of dumb stuff related to my professional life, but I was also very invested in the Dead Space remake that came out on January 27th. And it turned out to be a better game than what I was expecting, and it's way better than the original. And I gave the remake a 7.8 out of 10. I've already done a walkthrough, and I might do more content for it. But at the moment, there's a pause in the Dead Space remake content, and it has allowed me to devote time to this video with Resident Evil 4 Remake. Now, I have seen the full gameplay, so there's roughly 12 minutes worth of gameplay provided by Game Informer. I have cut out certain stuff because a lot of it is just like Leon and Ashley running through an area, nothing really related to the gameplay whatsoever. So I shortened this video down to 9 minutes and 6 seconds, and it's going to be focusing on the combat, it's going to be focusing on the stealth, or anything else related to the story of Resident Evil 4 Remake. And that is how the reaction video will go. I'm definitely glad I made that choice, because I'm not too sure what I would have said in those moments where Leon and Ashley aren't really doing anything. But this is when Leon rescues Ashley from the church, and a bunch of Ganado are in the church right now. And I can already see down there the puzzle for the stained glass is different. It looks like you need to collect gemstones now. But after successfully getting Ashley, the Ganado storm the church, and so they need to sneak away.
Lots of footage here to show you today, and I'm joined by Mark.
So just like in the original gameplay that they provided for Resident Evil 4 Remake, new Capcom is going to be putting in stealth for this game, and I'm going to say new Capcom because the team that's making this game is the same team that handled Resident Evil 2 Remake and also Resident Evil Village, which Resident Evil 2 Remake was a bad game, and then Resident Evil Village leaves me so conflicted as a Resident Evil player because it split my soul in two, and I have a lot of negatives towards Resident Evil Village, but not enough to hate it as much as Resident Evil 2 Remake or Resident Evil 3 Remake, and I am still playing that review for Resident Evil Village, but I still need to put all the script I have to commentary and then get the video footage, so I haven't made progress with that yet, but stay tuned for that.
Stuart, how are you?
So, you'll see right here, there are going to be some partner actions. We already saw partner actions before in the original version of Resident Evil 4, but it looks like they're going more for a Resident Evil 5 style of co-op action, where you press a button and you wait for your partner to arrive, and then you do the action. So they're trying to make Ashley a lot more involved with the gameplay that's happening. And on the one hand, I can understand why they did this, but on the other hand, Ashley was always a hindrance, which is why you just left her in a separate area and just dealt with the enemies that way. And she wasn't so much of a hassle, aside from Chapter 3 of Resident Evil 4. And not to mention the actual cowering mechanic that Ashley had whenever enemies were close, would just cause her to get grabbed in a very cheap way. Like, she could even cower when enemies were downed on the ground. And also in the VR version, Ashley was even more annoying because she lagged behind so much because your movement was improved for the VR version, but not Ashley's movement. And they've actually detailed some stuff with Ashley, so I'll get to those when I get the chance. Here we have the Hunnigan conversations. So we're seeing all that. No, nothing important there, but Ashley runs into frame just out of nowhere and really close to Leon, which looked very weird. But they've changed the way Ashley works in this remake. So the developers mentioned that in the original version of Resident Evil 4, everybody just left Ashley in an isolated area, and they got far away from her just to deal with the enemies, which is logical, and that's exactly what they were trying to go for with the original game. But for some reason, they've viewed that choice as being bad. So what they've done, and I don't know how true this is, but the developers have made it where Ashley seems to stay near Leon a lot of the time, so you can't isolate her and just leave her in like a bin or leave her in some isolated area. It's weird. But in order to balance this design out, they've removed Ashley's HP. So she has unlimited health, but eventually she'll reach a threshold where she will go into a down state, and if the enemies attack her while she's in the down state, she'll die, which, for one thing, is very odd because the Ganado are trying to keep Ashley alive so that she can be a sleeper agent for the Los Illuminados, so that she can infiltrate the presidency in America. So why they would be trying to kill her is very odd, unless you're talking about some of the rogue or very feral BOWs that don't exactly have the intelligence of the Ganado, like for instance with the Cormillos or with the Novistadores. And we haven't received any confirmation if the Novistadores are returning in this game, or I mean, we know the El Gigante is back, and we can understand that he's a feral BOW, so I can understand he would definitely try to kill Ashley because he doesn't have a shred of intelligence on the same level as the Ganado. So I'm guessing that's why the downstate was implemented. So they're kind of going for an approach similar to Revelations 2, where in Revelations 2, you had your main character and your partner character, and your partner character could regenerate their HP, but if they took enough damage, they would go down, and you had to revive them. I don't know if they could actually get killed by enemies when they went into that downstate because the enemies ignored them. So I don't know what the conditions were in Revelations 2 for your partner character to die, but I don't think they're going to be that ambiguous with the conditions of Ashley's dying state with this remake. But we have a couple of stuff to loot, and here's the map. Look how massive this map is, by the way. And like we can see the lake, we can see the fish farm, the quarry, church. We have a Torres Mendez's manor, which is cool. Yeah, like look at this. This is pretty massive. I mean, it already feels more massive than the village area from Resident Evil Village. Like the corner of the borders for the village area would just be Village Square, Chief Mendez's Manor, Fish Farm, Church. So like if you use those as your four corners and just draw the lines from there, that would effectively be the size of the village in Resident Evil Village. But here, it's a lot larger, which I do like. But of course, we already know like the size of the village in Resident Evil 4. It did feel pretty large with the number of areas you were going to. And I do wonder if this kind of expansion will apply to the castle area and the island area. And they have confirmed that the island is back. A lot of people hated it. I mean, I don't really understand a lot of the hate. I mean, I do understand that there were certain sequences that were pretty bad in the island area, and people felt like it went more action oriented, but I didn't really see much of a difference with the action, in all honesty, aside from, I mean, yes, you have that chopper there, you have a Mike coming in, providing you support, but like that makes a lot of sense for that to be the case. But like, I don't see how that compromises the survival horror aspect, just with this little diversion here and there. I mean, you're still having to manage your inventory, you're having to be very strategic with how you deal with the enemies. So like I don't see how that's a violation of the survival horror aspect, but ignoring that, let's just return to this. And by the way, this entire village area is called Val de Lobos. I was wondering what that name was when I reacted to the previous trailer for Resident Evil 4 Remake, and that's what this area is called. This whole entire village area is called Val de Lobos.
Game now, which is nice.
Yeah.
So I believe it looks like we have the what do they call it in Resident Evil 1 Remake, where like certain sections of an area turn red if there are items inside, and once you clear out all the items, the areas would go blue. It looks like this mechanic is returning, just like in Resident Evil Village. So yeah, so that search function to the map system where it's red when there are items still present seems to be returning in this game, which is cool.
Around while it's happening.
Because there's a lot of ambiguity with whether you picked up a lot of items or not, so it's good to see that they've removed that sense of ambiguity by introducing this mechanic again, or maybe that's just the coloration they chose. I don't know. So we have a couple of items here. So here we have treasures again, so they're reintroducing those. I mean, if the team that handled Resident Evil Village is handling this game, then most likely the treasures will be forced upon you, which is really retarded. So this game will probably be like a pay-to-win gameplay loop where you have to constantly invest into the treasures and sell them so that you can upgrade your damage on your weapons. Although, like, with how expansive Leon's array of moves is, maybe that's not going to be the case. But I don't believe that will be the case because, like, new Capcom completely misunderstood the implementation of the merchant system in the original Resident Evil 4. And it soured the experience of Resident Evil Village entirely. I mean, it doesn't bother me so much with how much I played Resident Evil Village, but it's still really dumb. And like, I can excuse this kind of system of upgrading your weapons or just like finding treasures and selling them in Dead Space because I feel like there's a sense of groundedness to it, and I don't feel like Dead Space's gameplay is on the same level as Resident Evil's gameplay, where like the fundamentals are very strong as they are, because like Resident Evil 4's fundamentals were already very strong, and so that's what allowed the survival horror experience to stand out a lot more when you weren't using the merchant. And also the merchant itself just feels non-diegetic to the world of Resident Evil, and he feels like a gameplay mechanic given human form, whereas at least the stores in Dead Space felt more grounded in the universe they were in. And also, like, the amount of creativity you could do with the store system in Dead Space to allow you to save up on money in order to purchase power nodes and apply it to your weapons, or selling useless ammunition. I mean, like, there's something that I feel is impactful about that mechanic, while not compromising the survival horror experience of Dead Space. It's very hard to explain, but basically Resident Evil 4 Remake should not be emulating other survival horror games that have a store system like Dead Space does, because it doesn't handle it very well, and it feels very jarring, basically, when they're forcing treasures and money upon you just to upgrade your weapons, just to influence the fundamental flow of gameplay. So let's continue on.
In the beginning, you saw Leon and Ashley sort of just about like, hey, we need to get out of here.
Also, right here, so they brought back the blue posters. So this is what led to the side activities in Resident Evil 4. Although Resident Evil 4 only really had like one side activity, which was just finding those blue medallions, and you just get the Punisher, which I never do because I don't see the point in that. But they've expanded upon that system. So basically, there are additional um, side tasks, as I'm going to call them, because these feel more like tasks than actual missions. And you partake in them, and you just get rewards from the merchant. So if Resident Evil 4 Remake is going to be designed with the merchant in mind, most likely you'll be forced to do these. Although in Resident Evil Village, you never had to go to side areas. Like, very rarely did you have to go to side areas. I mean, like when you were going to where that Varkalak Alpha was to get like Magnum ammo and also some treasures. That didn't feel like so much of a side area, and plus, like, it's very close to the main path, so you can't really say, oh, it's so far off the main path, it's to be considered the side area. But, like, you know, fighting that Urias Drock fellow in Beneviento's grave, and also in Otto's mill in Resident Evil Village, those feel more like side activities. But you didn't have to partake in those, which was good, because those are reserved more for New Game Plus, and the Urias Drock boss fights are absolute garbage in Resident Evil Village. But this doesn't feel on the same level as Urias Drock from Resident Evil Village. I feel like this is just more so an optional thing for the merchant. So how much it'll be forced upon you, that remains to be seen. But these objectives vary. So here you have to destroy the tombstone emblems. There's another one for killing a dog that's infected. So like killing a colmillo, basically. And I'm sure there are other things as well. I don't know how expensive this will be, or maybe like this is something only exclusive to the village area, because I don't see why these blue posters would be in the castle or the island area. But now we have this, so this is where the gameplay is going to start, and you can see in the bottom right corner, that is the command icon to showcase the status of Ashley. So this command icon means that Ashley is going to be sticking with Leon. It's basically the follow command from the original version of Resident Evil 4. And here, Leon says spread out, so this is where Ashley is going to be very distant from Leon, but at the same time, she's not going to be isolated in that area, so you can't tell her to wait. She will apparently follow Leon the entire time, which I don't understand. Or maybe the developers explained it poorly. Maybe you can isolate her in some other area, because, you know, like, she's supposed to be just a package, basically. Like, she doesn't have any fighting experience at all, so you have to put her somewhere else where the enemies won't try to get her. But it just seems very dumb that she can just stay near you at all times, even when you tell her to, like, spread out. I'm hoping it's just miscommunication on the developer's part. But let's continue on. So here we see our very first stealth kill. So we never saw this in the previous gameplay of Resident Evil 4 Remake, but pressing a button, you can stab Ganado, and that will prevent them from turning into plagas. So you do consume some of your knife durability, and also right there, you get a kitchen knife. So you can pick up the enemy's knives. Very strange. This is the very first Resident Evil game where you can actually pick up enemy weapons. Although technically you can't really say that though, because she wasn't exactly holding a kitchen knife in her hand when she died. It just spawned out of her when it doesn't make any sense. So it's treated more so like ammunition or consumable. So I can't really say that this is the first Resident Evil game where you can take an enemy's weapons, similar to Evil Within, where if an enemy had an axe or a torch and you killed them, you could pick it up and use it against the other enemies. It's not the same like that, so it's just a random drop you get. But they mentioned that you'll be able to go through Resident Evil 4 Remake knife only, which I was flabbergasted by. And if you saw my community post, I fucking hated that. Like, I've already gone on and on about the problems with knife only and how it indirectly influences the developers to do less. The sequences aren't going to be very complex, and like even embracing the very idea of knives out. Like, look at the Resident Evil Village developers and how deluded they are to think that Resident Evil Village is serviceable for just melee weapons in general, and they don't even specify difficulty as well. So it makes it seem like the run is generalizable to all the difficulty modes, but that's so fucking retarded. And if you've seen my gameplay of the Knives Out video where I'm just hating on new Capcom and other people that do stupid runs, you'll see how fucking stupid the gameplay looks. You don't even feel like you're playing a game. There's a fine line between a practical, difficult run and something that just feels like, oh, I'm a drug addict seeking fix, so I'm just trying to compromise the gameplay experience to get some kind of pseudo experience to allow me to inflate my dick, basically. New Capcom validating that just goes to show a lack of respect towards their game, and I point this out so much in my review. I don't really understand how anyone can need an explanation on the folly of Knives Out or knife only in general. But, like, if you need an explanation, then you're a fucking alien. I mean, I hate the fact that new Capcom said that this game is just going to be possible to do knife only. And they didn't even specify difficulty as well, so it means most likely you can just do knife only on every single difficulty, and it's going to feel very weird. There's going to be a lot of dumb moments in the game where, like, it just feels like an uncoordinated mess. It just feels like a hodgepodge of really poor ideas put together. And you're just going to be ignoring so many of the mechanics at play. Like, what the fuck is the whole point of putting in, like, flinch animations? What's the whole point of putting in guns and ammunition if you're going to be designing the game for knife only? Like, if you're going to be setting that as your baseline experience, why do you bother giving all these different mechanics? It doesn't make any sense. And also, like, as I've already mentioned, like, the developers acknowledging the knife only restriction, and they're almost acknowledging it as if they designed the game like that. It only goes to show how delusional the developers can be, and it just forces you to perceive the developers in a bad light. And that's what new Capcom did, unfortunately, with Resident Evil Village, and that was one of the main contributing factors that led me to believe that the Resident Evil Village team is the stupidest development team ever for the entire Resident Evil series. And I've gone on and on about the poor designs of Resident Evil Village, and its really awkward and badly told story, and the really compromised gameplay mechanics, and also how fucking deluded the developers were when putting in this kind of knife-only restriction. You'll probably have to use the merchant to upgrade your knife, all this kind of stuff. And you'll be running past the enemies the entire time. So, like, they'll set up the spawns in such a way where you don't have to deal with the enemies, or you have to do some of the most, like, awkward and hard to look at movement to just get past a bunch of AI systems, like they're obstacles in the fucking Olympics, and it doesn't feel like a survival horror game at that point. It's not hard to explain at all. It's just a matter of, can you even comprehend what I'm saying if you're human? But more on this when I do my review. But yeah, so we can pick up the kitchen knife, so we have an additional knife, so you're not just restricted to the combat knife, although I do question the point of the repair function, if you can carry multiple knives. So, like, is the repair function and the upgrade... Oh yeah, that's another thing as well. If you can upgrade the knife's damage, does that only apply to Leon's combat knife? So every other knife, when you fully depleted their durability, they'll just be completely destroyed and you can't repair them? Because I would just imagine that would be very strange. And, like, how would you designate the correct knife for repair based on the way they've set up the menus for the merchant when you're repairing or upgrading your knife damage. I question how that's going to be, but the only thing I can think of is you can only upgrade the combat knife that Leon had from Marvin's. Apparently, that combat knife that he has is the same knife that Marvin gave him in Resident Evil 2 Remake, which doesn't make any sense because he broke that knife if you were playing the game the way it was intended to be played, with just knife only, and he picked up multiple combat knives, so how could it be the one that Marvin gave him? It doesn't make any sense. But right here, you'll notice that Leon told Ashley to follow him, so she's following him now, and then this guy gets spotted.
And yeah, this part.
Here are the flinch animations at play. So the flinch animations, when I was looking at them, they didn't look very good. I mean, at times it looks like the enemy does flinch consistently from shots, but then other times you might notice like he's flinching, but then he doesn't flinch again, which is so bizarre. And then there are other times where during a flinch animation, you can shoot the enemy while they're flinching, and you will trigger another flinch animation. So I don't understand how the animations could be so inconsistent, and most likely this is all indicative of like a damage-based system where like you have to deplete a stun HP, and if they're in the middle of that flinch animation, their stun HP doesn't decrease, so you have to wait for them to get back into an animation. But even then, like I did see in the early gameplay of Resident Evil 4 Remake instances where the Ganado were in a completely neutral state and they were just walking towards Leon, and he shot them in their body and they didn't flinch. And I'm not talking about like some Ganado that's in the process of being turned into a Plaga, or they have like broken limbs or anything like that. I mean just a completely normal Ganado, and they don't flinch properly from the bullets, and even from the shotgun. Like the shotgun's flinch animation didn't look right, but I'll explain more when you see them.
Fun to get through. I tried to get through.
But watch this. So this is interesting. So they brought back this mechanic. They're finally bringing back this mechanic after so long. And the last time we saw this mechanic where shooting an enemy in the leg while they're running actually knocks them over because that's realistic feedback. That's how any enemy would react to a bullet if they were running. Like the last time we saw this was in Resident Evil 6, and you could say Resident Evil 7 had it in the Not a Hero DLC when you shot the Mama Molded in her leg after you stunned her the first time, and she was running. But I mean that was more so a case of special circumstances rather than an actual consistent mechanic. But like Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake, and Resident Evil Village didn't have this mechanic whatsoever, but they finally brought it back. But the problem is, I can't say for certain that I can respect this mechanic because, again, if this game is going to be using Resident Evil Village as a baseline, they'll probably remove all the stun animations on the hardest difficulty because that's new Capcom's diluted ideas to what promotes like a challenge, just removing all animations, just removing fundamental animations that balance out the gameplay, and so you're having to rely upon exploits, or having to rely upon really stupid strategies, and that just goes to show they have no respect for their animation department if they're going to be neglecting like animations like that throughout the entire hardest difficulty. And the hardest difficulty is meant to be the developers' true like perspective on what their game is. That's meant to be the true experience that they want you to go through, because that's part of the stress of survival horror, or like just in any game in general. That the hardest difficulty is meant to showcase the culmination of the developer's work and their mindset when they were designing all that. That's where you get a better understanding of that on the hardest difficulty. And if they remove these kind of animations, then they don't have any respect for their gameplay, they don't have any respect for the gameplay experience and the fundamental mechanics, and they don't have any respect for their animation department. So I'm not going to show much excitement for this, because I know they'll remove it, because that's just how new Capcom is. But she gets floored to the ground, and then Leon's able to finish her off. So finishing off enemies in general with the knife allows you to avoid the Plaga mutation. And then right here, Ashley gets grabbed. So this is really cool. So there is a context-sensitive stab kill, just like in the Evil Within 2. Because remember in the Evil Within 2, whenever Torres got grabbed in Chapter 10, and an enemy was just pummeling her while she was on the ground, you could go behind them and press X to instantly kill them. And this game has taken influences from the Evil Within 2, so they've applied it to here. So you can use the knife to instantly kill an enemy when they've grabbed Ashley, because they're in the middle of walking away and just keeping Ashley still on their shoulder, and they're so focused on that they can't defend against Leon. So that's why he's able to instantly kill this enemy, and it makes so much sense, and it costs durability, which I think that's a really cool design choice. I do like that. And also, you might not have noticed, but when Leon was in these animations, he was also getting iframes. So when he went into the knife stab animation earlier, or when he goes into his melee attacks, he gets iframes, just like in the original version of Resident Evil 4, which is great. Because of the number of enemies that you're dealing with, and the chances for them to throw their weapons, and the chances for them to be very douchey, you need iframes to balance that out. That's just part of the balance right there. That's part of making the gameplay less of a mess. And it actually puts incentive on the melee, because if you could just take damage all the time, there'd be no point in doing the melee, and your options would be very limited, and the gameplay would just fall apart. And like normally I'm against iframes, especially with a lot of high octane games that just use iframes like crazy, that it just the gameplay just becomes chain iframes all the time. Just go from iframe to iframe to iframe to iframe, and it just looks really stupid, like with Ninja Gaiden. But here, it's needed for Resident Evil 4, or like Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. It's needed for these games because of the design philosophies that they favor and the number of enemies that you're dealing with, and also with their capabilities. It helps balance that out. I mean, like in Resident Evil 6, though, the enemies could attack you during those animations, and so a lot of the times you got out of those animations, and you just immediately took damage, and it was pretty cheap, and so you had to watch yourself when you were doing your melee, but it was for a really dumb reason. But like, Resident Evil 4 and 5 get the melee system right. I mean, I think Resident Evil 5 gets it right better than Resident Evil 4 because of the passivity on the enemies whenever you're coming out of an animation that involves iframes, and that balances out the number of enemies that you're dealing with, and also with certain problems that they have. Resident Evil 5 gets a lot right with the melee system, and I'm hoping this game does that, but again, it's new Capcom, and if Resident Evil Village's developers are handling this, then the stupidest development team is going to make the stupidest mistakes ever. But right here, we see the quick select menu, which is awesome. So you can allocate grenades to certain sections. You can allocate weapons. Like, it's just basically Occam's razor. Like, in some other game, like Resident Evil 4, you'd be going into the menu and selecting your weapons. But here, they've achieved the same result, but it's just much more streamlined. And it doesn't break the gameplay experience when you're having to interrupt the gameplay just to go back into a menu, which I do like. But here, he uses the shotgun, and I do not like the shotgun stun from here. See, look at that. The two enemies right there on the left, they didn't react to the shotgun properly. They didn't get knocked back. The spread on that shotgun should have done so much more, but they didn't. Resident Evil 4's shotgun is so much better than the Remake's version of the shotgun. Even Resident Evil 5 does the shotgun so much better than this. But again, like, ever since, like, the advent of Resident Evil 4, every single game after Resident Evil 4, and I don't just mean the Resident Evil games, I mean, like, all games in general, as soon as the animation systems got a lot more complex and they put in more lines of code for more complex animations, more believable animations, it compromised the fundamental reactions that the enemies can have to certain shots. Because the animation systems were a lot more basic in Resident Evil 4, that's why the flinch animations could work so much better. That's why the shotgun could knock over as many enemies as it did, because the animation systems were a lot more simple at the time. But as the animation systems have gotten more complex over the years, it leads to moments like this where the flinch animations don't make any sense, and the number of enemies that just didn't get knocked over by the shotgun is very concerning, so the shotgun's not going to be very reliable for crowd control, and I doubt even the stumble mechanic, where you just knock an enemy into another enemy, will be very helpful in this case. So that's very, very concerning. But you see this right here. He shoots this guy 2 times, right? Like, so the first shot makes him flinch, and then while he's in the middle of the flinch animation, he generates another flinch animation. But why is it so inconsistent with when the enemies choose to get stunned or not? It makes no sense, and it leads me to believe it's a damage-based system. It's based on arbitrary damage values, and that's what new Capcom will favor on the highest difficulty. So the guns will not be reliable, and they'll just use it as a way to justify their Knives Out restriction for Resident Evil 4 Remake, and it's so stupid. And I bet if this game is going to have a challenge system, the Knives Out challenge is going to have the most CP out of every challenge out there, because that's how deluded new Capcom is, and not understanding the folly in trying to put knife only into this kind of game. I've already, like, flogged this dead horse so much, and I'm going to be doing so later on if the opportunity presents itself. But let's just continue on. So he dies. There's the he could actually deflect that. You see right there, even though the enemy is behind Leon, he still gets the prompt for deflection. That being said, though, it might be because the game feels the enemy is slightly in front of Leon because of the awkward angle he's at in relation to Leon. So maybe that's why the prompt registers, but I don't think the deflection is omnidirectional. So that's going to be a bit problematic. I mean, to be fair, though, like, Resident Evil 6's counter wasn't omnidirectional as well. You had to face the enemy in order for the prompt to actually register so that you could actually counter. So, fair is fair, I guess. But if they make the deflection omnidirectional, that'd be great. But I said before in my original reaction to the gameplay of the village encounter that the deflection didn't seem to drain durability, but it actually does right here. The deflection will actually drain durability. You'll see it later on. But here we have the inventory, and as you can see right here, we have the resources that we picked up earlier. We have the crafting supplies, so they've integrated the crafting supplies into here. I question how this will affect the flow of gameplay, because if they're putting the crafting supplies in the inventory rather than in its own separate menu, I question if this is because, oh, you can just buy ammunition from the merchant, so that's why we put the crafting supplies in here, because whether we put the crafting supplies in the inventory or not, it won't matter so much because you can just buy ammunition from the merchant. Or wait, it won't matter because you'll just be approaching the game knife only anyway, so that's why we put the crafting supplies in here. Like, Resident Evil Village needed the crafting supplies to be in its own separate menu because of how unbalanced that game is, and with how much you had to just damage race everything, with how absurd the HP was with the enemies in Resident Evil Village on Village of Shadows difficulty. That's why the crafting supplies were in their own separate menu, to complement the unbalanced nature. That's pretty dumb, but I don't know what this says. Like, that's my interpretation as to why they put the crafting supplies into the inventory this time rather than in its own separate menu. It's because they most likely view the crafting supplies as not being that important, and because of the fact that they're putting in the Knives Out challenge anyway, so would it really matter if the crafting supplies were in their own separate menu or not? That's the only thing I can think of when looking at this. But you can see he has the two knives, so you can see the combat knife in the top left, the very top left, so that's the knife from Resident Evil 2 Remake that Marvin gave him somehow. You have the kitchen knife, you have all these other weapons. I think the person must have upgraded their inventory, because you could not hold this much stuff in the original version of Resident Evil 4 when you didn't upgrade your inventory. So, yeah, so that's interesting to see. And I know the attaché case in Resident Evil 4, it's not the same as the attaché case that they introduced in Resident Evil Village, because the attaché case that they introduced in Resident Evil Village had problems that the original version of Resident Evil 4 didn't have. So I'm betting they're using Resident Evil Village as the template for the attaché case. So a lot of the videos that I've posted of the poor designs involving the inventory system in Resident Evil Village, those poor designs will likely be preserved in this remake as well, so that's going to be problematic. But you'll see we also have the normal grenades, we have the flash grenades. Apparently flash grenades take 2 slots for some reason, whereas normal grenades take only 1 slot. I wonder if that's any indication as to the DPS of the grenades, like the actual damage that the grenades provide. Because if these normal grenades are only going to take 1 slot, then most likely it means that they're not that valuable, or like they're not going to do a lot of damage. Whereas the flash grenades are taking 2 slots, and the reason why they take 2 slots is because of their benefits when you're dealing with the plagas. So that's an interesting idea to take from this with the storage space provided.
So you're gonna notice there's gonna be a few jumps.
See that right there?
So
Again,
notice,
no flinch. I mean, it was just a partial flinch, but like, it's not exactly a flinch that affects his movement. It's just, oh, he just reacts to it like you would if you're just flinching from like a scary noise or something. It's not something that affects your movement. It's just an animation that's independent of his actual movement. So even when he does it, he's still going about his normal business, doing whatever animation he's doing, with strafing or just walking or running. Like, that's not a real flinch animation. Like, why is it so inconsistent? Like, look at it. He's in a normal state. He's not in any kind of flinch animation, and he just doesn't react to the shot correctly.
There's gonna be a few.
Like, see, look at that. I don't get it. What is the governing factor that is actually dictating whether an enemy gets flinched or not. I don't understand. And I don't know if it's just body part specific or if it's just something that applies to all the body parts in general. So, like, this same issue with the flinch animations will still be present, even when you hit an enemy in the head. Like, I don't understand. I don't know how the AI system governing the flinch animations is handling the flinch animations in this game.
Jumps in the clips here. Again, that's a Capcom thing, so this is...
Oh, and also, they changed this as well. So, it seems like they're taking an influence from Resident Evil 5 right here, but in the original version of Resident Evil 4, killing an enemy with a melee attack would always prevent them from transforming. But in Resident Evil 5, if you did, like, the regular melee attacks, like Chris's straight, or Sheva's kick, or like all these other like animations that aren't the neck breaker, the throat slit, or the haymaker, or the backhand, or the spinning back kick, or the what's that move called where Sheva jumps on them and just launches them to the ground, like the head split or whatever it's called. Like, if you didn't do those specific animations, the enemies could still mutate. So, like, if Chris did not do those animations, if Sheva did not do those animations, or like they just did their regular straight, or they just did like some other animation, they would still trigger the Plaga mutation. So melee is not a safe option for when you're dealing with the enemies and you're trying to stop them from transforming. It will still trigger the transformation if you don't specifically finish them off with your knife. So that's very problematic. So you see right here, although interestingly he didn't convulse, but like it's a very specific animation. Like in the Resident Evil 6 where like the normal zombies, like when you had those zombies that could transform into the Bloodshots, they went through a very similar animation where like they stumbled backwards and then they immediately underwent the transformation to turn into a Bloodshot. This enemy is doing that basically. But like it's not as like noticeable or as like cinematic as how it is in Resident Evil 6 with the nature of the animation. It just comes out of him. And this is something as well. Will the Plaga instantly damage Leon if he's right near it? Because in the original version of Resident Evil 4, the Plagas took their time to come out of the host's head. In fact, it was already demonstrated right here, actually. So, like, the Plaga took time to come out of the host's head. So it gave Leon plenty of time to get away before the Plaga could actually damage him. So that's good. I'm glad it's not like Resident Evil 5, where like the Plagas just emerged from the head instantly upon decapitation, or when you dealt enough physical trauma. So you just took immediate damage from them because their active frame period was incorrectly placed in the animation of coming out of the head. So it's nice to see that they haven't taken that issue from Resident Evil 5, and they've instead taken that good design from the original version of Resident Evil 4.
Of the chapter,
and also, this was initially concerning, but I'm glad to see it's in the game. So flash grenades will still finish off the Plagas, which makes sense because the Plagas, they're sensitive to light. They don't have the resistance to sunlight or any other light source that emits a very similar spectrum to sunlight. And it makes sense because they were fossilized in that mine area, and so they haven't been exposed to sunlight for millennia. So it makes sense why this would be the case. I mean, in Resident Evil 5, Tricell introduced improvements of the Plaga by injecting a dominant gene from the dominant Plaga into a subordinate Plaga, and this created a Type 2 Plaga, so they could walk around in sunlight freely, but they were still able to be killed by the flash grenade, because the flash grenade emitted a light spectrum stronger than the sunlight, and so that's why it killed them. But, you know, it's great to see that they're respecting that. However, the problem is, in an interview that they did for Project Resistance, they said that the NE-alpha parasites were derived from the Las Plagas, yet why is it that the NE-alpha parasites don't have the same vulnerability to sunlight like the Las Plagas? Like, why can't flash grenades kill NE-alpha parasites in Resident Evil 3 Remake if supposedly they're derived from the Las Plagas? That interview was handled very poorly for Project Resistance, and I don't even know why they tried to tie it in like that. That's really retarded. Getting this confirmation that flash grenades can kill Las Plagas, it puts that whole connection between the Las Plagas and the NE-alpha parasites into contention because of this vulnerability to sunlight and to the flash grenades. That's non-existent for the NE-alpha parasites. It's very odd. So yeah, we still have all this, and this is interesting. So you'll see right here, we have the insignia key, and we also have the hexagon piece A Now, strangely, these are key items. These are key items that progress the story. But it seems like once you've actually fulfilled the use of the key item, it seems like you can sell them now. This is the first Resident Evil game where you can sell key items, which is very strange. And apparently you can sell the combat knife, even though that's technically the knife that Leon had from Marvin, so that's a little odd. And it's interesting because, like, in Resident Evil Village, you were forced to carry the kitchen knife at all times. Except in this game, it looks like you can sell them. And I wonder if this game has the whole feature where you have to have one ranged weapon in your inventory at all times, which is very contradictory to the Knives Out challenge that they had for Resident Evil Village. And if that was an indication that Resident Evil Village wasn't serviceable for Knives Out, then I don't know what new Capcom was smoking. But anyway, we have all this stuff. Wow, the rocket launcher is very expensive now. It's 80,000 pesetas. In the original version of Resident Evil 4, it was about, what was it, like 30,000 pesetas? Am I correct? This is the most expensive the rocket launcher has ever been. 80,000 is a lot. But of course, with the treasures, it's probably not going to be so bad. But yeah, the fact that they're introducing the rocket launcher again, they're definitely paying respect to the original version of Resident Evil 4, where you could just use the rocket launcher to get past certain bosses and like kill off a lot of enemies in one go. I honestly wonder if the rocket launcher will have similar capabilities to the original version of Resident Evil 4 in terms of alternative ways of solving a room. Like, for instance, in the mine area in Chapter 4-2, I think? Yeah, Chapter 4-2. You could destroy the giant boulder with the rocket launcher. You didn't have to restrict yourself to using the dynamite. You could use the rocket launcher to destroy the boulder, which was one of the coolest design choices I've ever seen in a game. And barely any game has that kind of flexibility in terms of using weapons creatively like that. But I wonder if this remake will have anything like that. So if you do find a rocket launcher in the environment, you might be able to use it for something very creative. But of course, it contradicts the Knives Out restriction that the developers had in mind. So why bother cherishing this mechanic? I don't know. Oh, and also right there, they've brought back autosaves, but most likely they'll remove the autosaves. Although, if it's the Resident Evil Village team developing this, they'll still introduce the autosaves, and the autosaves were needed in Resident Evil Village with how unbalanced that game was, and with how badly placed the typewriters were. Like, I do talk about this in my review as well, but the typewriters are placed so poorly in Resident Evil Village. I mean, unless you're talking about the boss typewriters, that's fine, but, like, why isn't there a typewriter before, like, the first, like, an ambush when you're in that village area for the first time, after you get the knife and the pistol? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Why they wouldn't put a typewriter before that moment. It's really dumb. And, like, the first typewriter you get is in Louisa's house, but why the hell would anyone want to put a typewriter save before a cutscene where you have to interact with Louisa and all the other villagers, and there's no gameplay for a while? Like, what the fuck were they thinking with that? That's one of the most retarded placements I've ever seen for a typewriter save, by far, in a Resident Evil game.
That goes into an underground tunnel that like takes you.
And you see right there? You see him convulsing? So that's an indication he's going to transform, and you can actually stop that transformation with a knife. But the weird thing is, it only seems to work if they're on the ground. And you already saw earlier, like, Leon kicked a guy, he was still on his legs, and then he was in the middle of transforming. But there didn't seem to be an option to use the knife. Like, if we go back, if we go back right over here, like, you see, he kicks the guy, right? But there's no option to use the knife against him. So why is it limited to when enemies are just on the ground? Why is it not applied to when enemies are just stumbling like this? That's confusing. And also, like, why is it that Leon is just restricted to using only his kicks? Like, for instance, in this moment right here, like, he shoots him and he generates a flinch animation that he can punish with his typical melee, but, like, why can't you use the knife as a substitute right over here? Like, it would make a lot of sense to have that kind of option. Like, using your legs to do the melee attacks, and that opens up the enemy to transforming, but at the same time, it saves your durability, and it can be useful for crowd control. Like, that's one option, but then the other option could be, oh, you can use the knife to get rid of this guy, but you're going to cost yourself durability, and you're not going to have a good crowd control option. But at least you'll ensure that the enemy doesn't transform into the Las Plagas. Like, that just seems very weird that it would work like that. Because like Evil Within had this, like when you were using bottles and you threw them at enemies' heads, you could actually stab them and instantly kill them. And like there were other options in Evil Within 2, like when you purchase that push kick, you could make an enemy flinch by shooting them in the leg and then push them back. I mean, you couldn't finish them up with your knife, which was very strange, but I don't understand why that's so hard to implement. I'm pretty sure I played games where they give you multiple options to actually like deal with an enemy. I mean, how is that any different to like a dialogue choice where like you're focused on one specific like NPC and then you have the option to select one option or another? Like, how can you not apply this to the melee system? That just seems very odd. So the fact that it's only applied, like just being able to use your knife on a Ganado when they're just on the ground, and that stops them when they're about to convulse and transform, yet it doesn't apply when they're just standing, that's just very strange.
So
But let's
all
push
paths-
forward now.
Framed, like, okay,
There's going to be a couple of enemies past this door.
Yeah. One of the producers.
I wonder if the enemies will be able to breathe fire. Like, they'll actually use the torch and breathe fire at you. And it was one of the coolest design choices in Resident Evil 4, because you could actually interrupt them when they were breathing fire. And they would be set on fire, and you could actually repeat this animation a second time. So when the enemies were about to breathe fire at you, you could knife them or shoot them twice, and you would deal fire damage to them. And that was a pretty good way of actually stopping them from turning into plagas, which was really cool. But I don't think the enemies will have that capability.
They were like, oh.
So that's a different animation. And this time she gets launched back because she's not in the middle of transforming, so she wasn't put into the animation where she transforms, just like the Bloodshots in Resident Evil 6.
Village at night.
And right here she's convulsing, so this should trigger a transformation right here. Yeah, and it did. You saw the motion blur just then from the explosion of her head. Right there. Yeah, so she transformed. Yeah, definitely a bit problematic, and yeah, you're gonna have to be very strategic with your melee, just like in Resident Evil 5.
I do agree.
And right here is very different. So you never went with Ashley to Victoria's Mendez's mansion. The mansion looks very different. Oh, and also this room looks very similar to Resident Evil 3.5. Like this room here, this was one of the areas where Leon could get attacked by the Phantom Hookman. And the room looks very identical. I mean, I'm just glad they didn't introduce the stupid Phantom design in the original version of Resident Evil 4. It had no place in the Resident Evil series. And then Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village came out, and the whole like hallucination idea was very interesting. It was a interesting angle to take in terms of psychological horror, and like Resident Evil 7 introduced psychological horror in a way that's interesting, although like Resident Evil Village, I don't really understand how Beneviento could influence Ethan if he was already infected, but like that's a little odd. And I mean, I know it's related to the pollen, and maybe like even when you're exposed to the mold, or you basically are made out of the mold, or whatever explanation they gave for Ethan, which is really stupid. I guess the pollen can still affect you somehow, which is odd, because technically, if Ethan was infected with the mutamycete, and I'm flip-flopping between mold and mutamycete, so I myself do that sometimes, but I'm sure you know what I mean, but like, it's just a habit with me. But with New Capcom, it makes no sense for them to flip-flop between mold, mutamycete, and megamycete. But you know, like if Ethan is technically exposed to the mutamycete, then surely his immune system would be used to like pollen from a plant that's infected by the mutamycete. That's a little odd. I mean, like Ellie, for instance, Ellie from The Last of Us, she had the cordyceps mutation in her head, and this is why she was able to not register the spores as an allergen, and that's why she wouldn't be infected by the spores. So I mean, it's a little confusing how Ethan could possibly be experiencing the hallucinations from Beneviento's pollen. Although maybe that's just me not understanding how resistance to allergens or any kind of hallucinogenic property works, but I'm sure, like, in terms of a game, you know, what I'm saying makes perfect sense with Ethan not being susceptible to the pollen. Whatever. And here we have, I've skipped out on intermediary gameplay and just gotten straight to here. But this is where we see the Colmillo. So the Colmillos look a lot bigger and a bit more ferocious in terms of their appearance and their normal state.
Mostly like outdoor.
But their mutation
there's
is
the
very
dog.
different. So now they have like a scorpion tail. I mean, I get they're trying to play off the whole Plaga Type A design right here, and they're trying to make it similar to that with like the blade at the tip of the flesh of the Plaga. But it still looks very weird, and I question why the Ajules in Resident Evil 5, the dogs, they had that split head. So like very interesting how the Plaga mutation can go from just a bunch of tentacles sprouting out of a colmillo to a split head mutation with the dogs, but this just seems a little too extreme. And I feel like this kind of mutation would only exist if you were talking about a more evolved form of the Plaga. Because, like, I don't see how this could possibly precede the Type 2 Plaga and the split head functionality that the Ajules had in Resident Evil 5. Not to mention their ability to discharge, like, bony material or, like actual blade-like material from their mouths as a range attack in Resident Evil 5. Like, this kind of mutation feels like a more extreme version of the Ajules mutation, so like I find it very odd that they would embrace this. I can't say I'm a big fan of this, and I also feel like this is going to present with problems in the gameplay, but most likely a similar case will apply where the Colmillos are not going to be an enemy worth encountering. I doubt they'll even put these in mandatory combat encounters. I don't really see how this version of the Colmillo could possibly work in mandatory combat encounters unless you're dealing with a handful of enemies. But like they integrated the Ajules into Resident Evil 5 and they could fight alongside the Magini, and it was fine aside from the moments where the Ajules didn't really flinch properly, and also they got hyper armor during certain attacks, like with the discharge technique that I already explained. But I don't see how this could work for the mandatory combat encounters, so I think they'll restrict these enemies to optional encounters, and it's just better to run past them. Not to mention, if they're gonna be embracing the knife-only restriction, what the fuck is the whole point of putting in the Colmillos into mandatory combat encounters if they conflict with the knife-only mentality? Like, this is, again, the problem with the knife-only mentality that the developers are embracing here. It forces them to limit the enemy diversity that you'll likely be encountering in later encounters, and it'll just present as very awkward, and you'll be taking damage all the time. It'll just become a mess because you don't have, like, the guns at your disposal. You're going to have to use your knives for that, and it takes too much effort to... Or not, actually, it takes no effort whatsoever to design enemy placements complementary to knife only. Like, this is why I don't understand why the developers can't get it through their thick skulls, the futility of knife only in their games. But whatever. I mean, I'm gonna probably do this game knife only in my blind playthrough. I mean, I'll still pick up weapons here and there and just store them into my inventory, but for the most part, I might as well just be doing knife only just to hate new Capcom's ideas for knife only from a more informed perspective, to vindicate myself and to vindicate my beliefs on new Capcom being the stupidest like development team ever for Resident Evil in general. And they already demonstrated this for Resident Evil Village, and if the same team is developing Resident Evil 4 Remake, then the same problems will be there.
Look at that thing.
Oh, right here,
It's like a scorpion tail.
this guy is very evasive. Look at him. He jumps to the side at a greater distance compared to the original Colmillo.
So yeah, Capcom also pointed out, for those wondering...
Flinch animations don't seem to be that good, but I do question... I mean, could you kill Colmillos with flash grenades in the original Resident Evil 4 when they expose their tentacles? I don't think you could. Like, there were certain enemies that had their plagas exposed, but you couldn't kill them with flash grenades. Like, you couldn't kill Garradors with the flash grenades for some reason. I mean, it might just be due to the way the plaga was attached to his back, but I don't see how that would make it resistant to sunlight. Or any kind of light spectrum similar to sunlight or stronger than sunlight. It was very odd, but I do question if they'll allow it with this version of the Colmillo because of how much the plaga has really exposed itself and how much it has really overtaken this Colmillo. And now we have this fight. So Luis still says his iconic quote, "It's game time," which I do like. I do like that line from Luis in the original game. But now we have to stand our ground against the enemies. So once again, you can use the shelves over here to block the enemies. You can also use wooden boards as well, but I don't think it's meant to be permanent.
It's
because at some point an enemy
at least
breaks
during
through
our
the wooden boards,
playthrough, the brute first
and it's a brand new enemy type as well.
dominated enemy.
Right.
In
So there
that
are the
area
wooden
just before
planks
the bridge
right
that we
there.
crossed.
So you use it,
Yeah,
and I'm guessing it's just there as a substitute to the shells. So it's just another aesthetic to the shelf design. Instead of shelves, they're just using wooden boards, so it achieves the same sort of outcome as the shelves. So I don't understand why they would design it like this.
But,
yeah, because in the footage we've put
And I'm guessing the cabin sequence is kill based, just like in the original game, because the HP of the enemies makes a bit more sense compared to Resident Evil Village.
out of this, people.
But here he's using the sniper rifle. I'm hoping you can get these weapons in the world. Like, I hate how you have to buy these weapons from the merchant. And like, Resident Evil 5 fixed this issue because they introduced such weaponry in the world as you were going through the game, and so you were introduced to the weapons in a more organic fashion, not through some really silly merchant system. And how he's able to lug those supplies, how he's able to update his inventory with new stuff for Leon to pick, it doesn't make any sense. Feels so non-diegetic to the world of Resident Evil, and then they tried to make such a character diegetic to the world of Resident Evil as if he's real with the Duke in Resident Evil Village. It's so retarded.
Guy.
It's so
shows up
goofy
in
and
this
silly.
fight, but you
Yeah.
actually fight him before this. So
yeah, so when
it
he
seems
shows
like
up in
he's
the
gonna
fight,
be-
There's a deflection, and as you see right there, if you look at the durability of the knife, it's lost. A portion of the durability is drained after that deflection. So yeah, I thought the deflections would not drain any durability. I mean, I thought this would only be the case with the Chainsaw Man, but it's also the case with other enemy attacks.
What were we saying?
yeah, he's definitely a recurring enemy. But when he shows up in the
And that's also problematic. So like Luis, he does kick the enemy away, but I feel like Luis is still going to be equally as problematic with creating a lot of plagas, because that was one of the main problems with Luis. While he was very active in shooting the enemies, at the same time he could increase your chances of encountering plagas, and you normally avoided the plagas by using the shotgun and by using other techniques. And also in the original version of Resident Evil 4, only very specific enemies could transform into plagas. Like, when you look at their modeling, like when you look at their character design, like specific character designs in the cabin fight could actually transform into plagas. Like, for instance, if we're talking about this guy that Leon is dealing with right now, like anyone that looks the same as this guy would not transform. Or in this case, they might transform. Like, I don't know if this kind of mechanic is going to be the case in this remake, where only very specific models of the enemies can actually transform into the plagas. That'll be interesting to test out, and I question how you could possibly do this encounter knife only. I don't think new Capcom really considered this, or maybe it's like, oh, you can purchase a lot of knives from the merchant, so maybe that's their substitute for this, but like, that just feels even more silly. And like, you're going to be using the deflect a lot. You're going to be using the melee to knock them over and then stab them. But what if the melee doesn't knock them over, though? Like I've already explained, if it doesn't knock the enemy to the ground and they go into that convulsive state when they're standing, you can't stab them with the knife. And how does knife melee even work in general? Because I hated the way it worked in Resident Evil 2 Remake, where the characters had to go through a lengthy animation to just pull the knife from their back. And this was only the case when they had their flashlights out, because in Resident Evil 2 Remake, the knife was classified as a sub-weapon, which is why you had to go through this very lengthy aiming animation, rather than just what happens in general when the characters have their guns out and they just aim instantly. And as long as the characters didn't have their flashlights out, you could instantly pull out your knife and aim at them. But we haven't even gotten a demonstration of that. Like, why haven't they demonstrated the knife melee? It makes no sense. Like, we've seen the deflection, we've seen the stabbing animations. I just want to see what aiming the knife and using it actually looks like so far.
What were we saying?
yeah, he's definitely a recurring enemy. But when he shows up in
But you see right there, the enemy's convulsing. So like I said, Luis is going to be a problem when he's creating plagas, and you have to use your knife to deal with them. One has to wonder why Luis doesn't have his own knife. Like, why can't he stop plagas from transforming? Like, if he's going to be given the ability to be so active when actually dealing with the Ganados, then you have to at least make him, like, not so much of a nuisance when he's just creating plagas spontaneously. And the way he would be avoiding this if he has the ability to stab enemies when they're on the ground or something. Like it's so strange that they don't give him that option.
The fight.
So I feel like Luis is going to be a bit of a handicap right here.
Already had to fight him before, and so I feel like it's extra tense because it's like, oh my god, I gotta fight.
It looks like the enemies can combo their attacks. That's interesting. So just like the enemies in Revelations 2, like when you had the Iron Heads, for instance, they could combo with their melee. With the basic enemies, they could combo with their melee. Particularly the normal enemies that had melee weapons, they could combo. So they've applied that to here.
Oh my god, I gotta fight this guy now.
Yes.
There's a convulsive state, and like at that range, I guess it's reasonable that the shotgun wouldn't knock them over. But I feel like in the original version of Resident Evil 4, that would have guaranteed a knockdown, even at that range.
I saw some people speculating that he might be a single persistent enemy.
And wow, the grenades look pretty underpowered. Yeah, look at that, look at that, look at that, look at that. What did I tell you guys? What did I fucking tell you? The grenades occupy only one slot in your inventory because they're underpowered, and you'll see it right here.
Speculating that he might be a single persistent.
I mean, in like the original version of Resident Evil 4, the Ganado could survive grenades if their plagas were exposed, but right here, look at the normal Ganados on the ground. Look at the guy coming, like, look at him, he's standing up! He's alive! What the fuck is that? What the fuck is that? That would never happen in the original version of Resident Evil 4, especially in an early chapter like this. The village Ganado had less health than the cultist Ganado and the mercenary Ganado, but even then, like, the cultist Ganado and the mercenary Ganado could still die instantly from grenades. That was the whole point of grenades in that game. But here, the grenades are just as underpowered as they are in the remake of Resident Evil 2, which is so retarded. I hate that. I don't know what it is with games nowadays, but they just cannot make grenades good nowadays.
I think he's
No,
just
I mean, it's unbelievable that he just survived that, and there's not even a scratch on him. But like, what the fuck? You don't see any bloodstains on him. You don't see any like explosive marks on him. He's perfectly fine. What the fuck?
I have killed him several times in different areas.
And so Luis can be grabbed right here. He gets grabbed from behind, so you can save him. I wonder if you can stab the enemies when they grab onto Luis. That'll be really cool, just like in Evil Within 2. But if you can't, that's really retarded, because then they're not taking influences from an actual great survival horror series with the Evil Within. Not to mention it's made by Shinji Mikami. But Shinji Mikami would have allowed that. He allowed that in the Evil Within 2 whenever enemies grabbed onto Torres, because you could then finish them off with a melee, and it was so balanced in that fight, and you got iframes the entire time. I mean, the camera was a big problem, though, when you were recovering from the animation, because the camera, the animations in general in the Evil Within 2 are very clunky. But I still love that this was in the game. I mean, like, when the enemy is doing an animation that they don't necessarily have to do, I should be rewarded for seeing that animation and punishing it accordingly. That makes a lot of fucking sense, but I don't think new Capcom will have that sense, because again, they'll probably be as equally as incompetent as the developers of Resident Evil Village.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that, no flinch animation. You see that? No fucking flinch animation. You can even see the blood spatter on him. Look, he shoots him, no flinch animation. That's some Resident Evil 5 garbage right there. Or just like Resident Evil 6 as well. Or whenever the enemies went into the active frame period of their melee, they would not react to your shots, even if you used a shotgun, a sniper rifle, or a magnum. They would not register any reaction because they get hyper armor during their active frame period. How could they bring this issue back? I mean, then again, like, they haven't had much experience with flinch animations ever since Resident Evil 2 Remake came out. But, like, honestly, it's stupid that they could be making the same mistake again. Yeah, the flinch animations in this game are trash. They really are. And they'll remove them entirely on the hardest difficulty just to justify this. Oh my god, it's... Oh dear. This is not going to be good. For all I know, this remake of Resident Evil 4 will not be as good as the Dead Space remake. This game will likely be like a 2 out of 10, just based on this gameplay alone.
Yeah.
Just the new enemy type.
And right here is the new enemy type. So you see right there, he smashes through the wooden boards. So, like, what's the... I mean, I'm guessing it's, like, a permanent thing, but, like, why would you then introduce shelves as well? It's weird. That I don't understand. I mean, is there some strategy involved with using the wooden planks on certain windows, and you can therefore add more strategy to the mix? 'Cause, like, what's the point though?
Pretty
But
wild as it is.
yeah, this enemy type we never saw in Resident Evil 4. So this is basically Resident Evil 4 Remake's interpretation of an Iron Head, because they literally look like the Iron Head with the mask on their head. Although this time it's an animal head, and they tried to emphasize the details on the animal head, in that the animal head isn't actually looking at you. That's to indicate it's a mask. And then he's also using the hammer as well. Like, the Iron Heads used hammers as well. I'm gonna class this as just an Iron Head.
Isn't the original, but even more so here. And there he is, Mr. Bullman. There's been a lot of like back and forth, like is he a cow, is he a bull? But I was like, he's
No flinch animation once again. Look at that. No fucking flinch animation.
a bull, but I was like, he's got a horn there.
Wow.
Not the bull thing.
No flinch animation again. Like, why is it so fucking inconsistent?
Not the bull thing.
Well, a bull is just a
And
cow.
you could probably excuse that to him being in a rising animation,
Horn
but
there.
still though.
Bull thing.
I mean, at that point in the rising animation, you could have gotten a flinch animation in the original version of Resident Evil 4. But not here,
Well,
it
a
seems.
bull is just a cow. It's a male cow.
I mean, yeah, they're the same thing. But you know, like bulls have horns.
Okay.
You know.
That's fair. That's
But here it is, right here. So, that was a quick time event just then. So you have the ability to press the right thumbstick to evade. Why is it that button? That just seems like an odd button for a QTE. I'm not going to damage my analog stick just to do something like this. Like, have it be some other button. What the hell? And is that even like a QTE, or is that just like, oh, you crouch under it, you just initiate the animation for crouching? Or does Leon actually do a context-sensitive animation where he flips or he rolls? Like, I don't understand.
Listen,
He's got a single horn.
But wow,
there.
that does a lot of damage.
listen.
He's got a single
And he also
horn
hits
there.
other enemies as well.
Leon just gets
But that might be problematic, because that might mean he can create plagas as well.
Bones of gems.
Oh, and also this right here is probably the biggest change ever with Resident Evil 4 Remake. They have a storage system now. Resident Evil 4 didn't have a storage system, they didn't have an item box system, but they brought it here in this remake. And one has to wonder why this feature wasn't applied to Resident Evil Village. And they said in the concept art for Resident Evil Village that they originally experimented with the item box system and trying to implement it into Resident Evil 4 Remake, but they just scrapped the idea entirely, and they instead favored the attaché case. So what the fuck is this? What are you playing at right now, new Capcom? You introduced a feature that was not in the original version of Resident Evil 4, and you also put this feature in after Resident Evil Village, when you were in the process of putting in like the item box system, but then you scrapped it entirely for Resident Evil Village. Why now do you have this change of heart? What the fuck is this? What the fuck is this bullshit? And I understand that in Resident Evil Village, you could sell your weapons to the merchant, and theoretically, it could serve as like a storage system, but it was a terrible storage system. Why the fuck would you even try to sell your weapons when you could just get inventory space? Oh my god. I feel so vindicated right now with them putting this feature in, and at the same time very frustrated that they could think to put in an item box system for Resident Evil 4 Remake, but not for Resident Evil Village. What the fuck is this bullshit right now? And like, it's just that standard item box system that you've known from the previous Resident Evil games. They had no trouble putting it into Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake, but they had trouble putting it in for Resident Evil Village. And now when they're supposedly using Resident Evil Village as a baseline, and they're taking influences from Resident Evil 4 as well, they now decide to put in an item box system that wasn't in Resident Evil 4 and Village? And Village would have benefited highly from this? What the fuck is this? It's all a fucking joke. This is a fucking bad joke on new Capcom's part.
There are now customized cases that have different bonuses. So like the
Yeah, whatever. Who cares about the bonuses?
charms.
And you can customize the cases to have different charms.
As you
Although I think that's all just DLC though, with the charms.
can't do that. Which does.
And that's pretty much it for the gameplay. Yeah, guys. So lots of positives, lots of negatives with this gameplay trailer. I mean, it still hasn't changed my opinions on this game because, again, the team that's handling this remake is the same team that handled Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil Village. And Resident Evil 2 Remake was a bad game. It's one of the worst Resident Evil games I've ever played. And then Resident Evil Village has the stupidest development team ever. And all of this gameplay here does nothing to waylay my skepticism towards this game at all. I have no faith that this will be like new Capcom's magnum opus. This will not be as great of a game as Resident Evil 7. It just won't be because it's managed by a really shoddy development team. I don't know the state of the company right now and whether they've adapted to the pandemic or not, but even if they aren't being affected by the pandemic, that still doesn't excuse the stupidest design choices that they favored with Resident Evil Village. There are so many bad design choices in Resident Evil Village that could easily be avoided if they had common sense. The pandemic played no role whatsoever in the implementation of those poor design choices. It has everything to do with how fucked up the mindset was with the developers of Resident Evil Village. And if they so easily put in those bad design choices in Resident Evil Village and didn't bother tweaking the game whatsoever, even after the release of the Winter's expansion, then I feel like this kind of lackadaisical behavior is going to be the case with Resident Evil 4 Remake. So that's why I'm still showing skepticism towards this remake right now. But that's all I have to say about this reaction video. Like I said, I'm 50-50 in my positivity and negativity. But I'll be reacting to more gameplay if Game Informer showcases more. But thank you guys for watching, and you take care now.